Bas, floor is yours.
Yes, okay. Lots of familiar faces, so nice. Now I'm going to save my introduction to the last because I just like to jump into the thing I'm going to talk about tonight. I've actually been given carte blanche, so the topic was interested about permissionless and permission blockchains, which is basically a topic that I've been talking about forever, because it's a very interesting split in what is happening in the communities and the industry. So it's nice to have somebody from IBM, because I've been talking to your colleague Louis de Bruin in 2 other panels already. So I was very glad not to have to do the panel this time, because that gets a bit repetitive. So my position is not per se that permission blockchains are bad. Let's be very clear about that. The title that I gave in the introduction was why I think they're boring. And that's my personal opinion. And I hope to at least explain to you why that is my position. I got into blockchains in 2013, when almost everything was very small groups of very enthusiastic people just working from their own homes. And that's also still the perspective that I'm working from now. So not necessarily people who are working from their own homes, typing away at keyboards, but the energy that I found there was very vibrant, with people trying new things, trial and error, but mostly also working for free. Not necessarily trying to make huge profits from their work, but they wanted to affect change. And everything at that time was permissionless blockchains. So Bitcoin was biggest, and we had quite a few altcoins and a few platforms. Ethereum didn't exist at that point. This is one of the slides that I will intersperse. There will be a lot of text. You can ignore that. You can just listen to me. But the slides, the one-sentence slides, are basically everything I'd like you to remember tonight. So those form the, let's say, the way through my presentation. So this is the first one. Truth is confirmed by inspection and delay, falsehood by haste and uncertainty. And this is my view on what happened last year with all the ICOs, all the projects which had very interesting and flashy white papers, but which were very hasty, which didn't really know where they went, and which are collapsing all around us at this moment. Most of them, not all. One thing that I think is really important for every blockchain project, so not necessarily a Bitcoin project, is starting from first principles. So not just thinking of this is where we want to go, we want to end world hunger or whatever, but also start, when you're using a system, knowing why that system actually works the way it works. I've already done a few presentations here about the history of Bitcoin, which didn't start in 2008, but at least started in 1981 here in Amsterdam. But it is very important to know how something works. If you want to drive a car, and more than just recreationally or for your work, it's quite interesting at least to know what it can do, and that you can't drive it up a mountain if the hill is too steep, and to know why. Those are engineering constraints of a project. So why do I think we need to start always to consider at least Bitcoin? Is because it's a very easy system to understand. It's very simple in what it tries to do, and from that you can try to figure out what you want a blockchain system to do. So the original Bitcoin design goals are important because they did not want to create a blockchain. That's not one of the reasons why Bitcoin was created. It's something of a narrative that started happening in 2015. Then corporations started talking about blockchains as if it's something different from the underlying thing it wants to be. So blockchain, you can't just pull it out of Bitcoin. It's like pulling an engine from a car, laying it on the ground and expecting it to do something useful. It doesn't. It just lays there and generates a lot of smoke and noise. That's the same thing with blockchain without a goal. So Bitcoin was solved very simply to solve a monetary goal. It's a very small and very narrow goal. It's a monetary goal, and the goal was, well, we'll see that in the next slide. Sorry, this is my words getting in my own way. So the corollary to this conclusion is you cannot just compare Bitcoin and blockchains. You cannot just say every blockchain has the same kind of way of evolving as Bitcoin will, which some blockchains do tend to take as a kind of a tenet. Let's start a blockchain, gather a community, and then it will grow, and the nodes will grow, and when the nodes grow, our value will grow, and then the utility will grow. This is what happened to Bitcoin. But because Bitcoin was the first, some different rules apply, and I'll explain that a bit later. But they're also very different because of what they want to do. Bitcoin is a transfer of value, so it stands to reason it needs to have a value. But if you have a system that just needs to, for instance, store data, you have a completely different way of evolving for the system, because then you need to artificially find incentives for the system to get value, which you saw by quite a lot of blockchains that are utility blockchains, which, like SIA or let's say we had StoreJ, and they had a lot of problems because they needed to inject value because they wanted to be a bit like Bitcoin, but actually something completely else. So let's go to just the Bitcoin design goals. This is the first sentence of the Bitcoin white paper. A purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. That's it. That's the design goal of Bitcoin. All the other things are explanations how it's going to do this. This is everything that it wants to be. One sentence. And this is an extra. This is the failure state. That's the main benefit is lost if it's written for the third party is still required to prevent double spending. That's the failure state of Bitcoin. If this happens, it's game over. Then we're done. So it's very clear. This is the abstract at the start. So we have a goal, which is directly send money. It's allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another. So it has an element of self-sovereignty. It doesn't want that third party in between. And it does that by various means, which we see a lot being used as buzzwords within blockchain systems. So we have peer-to-peer. Peer-to-peer is not an end in itself. It's a means to get here. Because if you're not peer-to-peer, you're a centralized system and you have the middleman again. So we do it by digital signatures to identify entities on the blockchain without actually needing to identify them in other ways. It's self-referential. We do it by hashes and we do it by etc. Basically, all of these words below and other words are being used in blockchain systems, especially if you look at those lovely white papers from last year, as these are things that we should want for themselves. Our system has hashes. Beautiful. Why? You need to know why. So, during my old presentations of the last 2 years, I made a list of what makes Bitcoin Bitcoin. And this was my old list. It has immutability, it has timestamping, it has public key cryptography, and it has a peer-to-peer network. This is my old list. The nice thing is, if you start from a position of you need to try to simplify what defines a system in itself, is you can start crossing things out. And basically on the basis that you try to find out which are actually means and what are ends. So I have a new list, and this is what for me defines Bitcoin at its core at the moment. This is open. All the other things are ways to get this without a middleman. That's an important one. I should maybe in parentheses put that one in. But it's the immutability of the system that is important. And in other presentations I try to explain why the immutability is important, especially for Bitcoin, but in the end for other systems. So in Bitcoin, it's not immutability because we want immutability. Again, it's still kind of a means. You need this to be able to prove that the coins that you have on the system are mined and have never been counterfeited. And therefore you need to be able to go through the first point where the coin is mined and then spend. So now it's in my wallet. How do I know it's real? How do I know it's not a fake Bitcoin? The only way I can do that without needing to ask somebody else is being able to go through all the transactions and see, yes, it's been mined on 1st of April 2013, for instance, and that's a legit mining action, so it's a real Bitcoin. That's why we want immutability. That's the reason. Not because it's cool, but because we need to be able to prove something. So even this immutability is linked to the design goal of Bitcoin. It's not something that exists in a vacuum, it's there for a very strict reason. There's a failure state, as I said, there's a trusted third party needed, therefore immutability is compromised, and therefore we can't determine whether coins are legitimate. So if the supply has been inflated, or if somebody has done a double spend, and therefore the chain is basically useless for what it's been designed for. That's the failure state. If this comes in at any point on the main chain, not on the other layers on top or on other ways, then the project has failed. Yeah?
Would you say there's a risk of failure with, like right now, the news that the 6 major mining companies, hold 80% of the miners, 5 of them are based in China, so that the third party might,
What would you say? Is that a risk? If 80% is in the hands of...
Yes.
That is a risk, exactly. That is a huge scare.
Yeah.
And
but aren't we already there? Isn't it like, okay, it's a huge scare, or is it already a huge reality?
We can see that it hasn't happened yet, but it could, definitely. So it's this kind of situation. Yeah.
The trust is gone.
And we get well, once it's been done, the trust at least is gone. Now it's a huge scare, but it's a biggie. And that comes from multiple parts, because you don't necessarily always need to compromise the chain itself. You can also centralize everything around it completely and then make it useless in that way. So if everybody would only work with custodial wallets, it's a pretty useless system. You can have it running, but if all the liquidity is caught up in a centralized way, you also have a problem. So, but I think that's probably the status of a system like this all the time. Yeah. It's always it always has a huge threat model. But this six miners having 80% of mining power, yes, that's bad. It is bad. There's no other way to say it. Yeah. But this, it's not needed at least, but it should be solved, definitely. So this is why I like systems like Bitcoin. They're simple, and simplicity also helps with another thing. If they make a claim, you can test it. It's very easy to test a claim when something is simple. They can say, like for instance, the miners. And you can quite easily, you can check, okay, is this decentralized or do we have a mining problem? You can go and check and say, yes, we have a problem. You can also immediately check, has there been a double spend? It's a very simple thing to check that. No, there hasn't been, but we need to be very, 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 very careful and try to find a way to break this. So it's also very easy to debate about it. Like the energy debate about Bitcoin, how much energy does it actually cost? There are different ways to calculate that. but there is only a limited scope of possible outcomes. They differ by a factor of 10, which is quite a lot, but at least it's a quite narrow scope where you can start talking and say, okay, when is this a problem, or is it actually a problem? It makes it easy to discuss. The dialogue is much easier. So, then we come to blockchains, and this is where my boredness and problem comes in, because blockchain design goals are often a very big question mark. They're not clearly defined. And without knowing what you want to achieve, you cannot engineer a system. That's really hard, because you have no way what to engineer for. You don't know what load it needs to have. You don't know what characteristics it needs to have. You don't know where the attack vectors are, because you have no idea what you're actually wanting to do. And this can take two forms. It can take the form in not knowing what you want to do, and a more sneaky version is, let's do everything. Let's try to make a blockchain which can do everything, basically. And this is a problem that Ethereum definitely had, and a lot of the platforms also had. You get this feature creep where you want to be everything, but if anybody that did any advertising or worked in a company that needed to put a product on the shelf, they know if you try to target everyone, you actually are targeting no one. And this is your effort is completely scattered and your product won't sell, so it won't land. But it also works the other way. If you don't know what you're building, you have no idea where to start. So blockchain projects are all over the place because they do not strongly define, mostly, what they want to achieve, what their end state is, and also when they would fail. So quite a lot of projects threw out the central tenet of disintermediation for the reason of immutability. So we have Hyperledger Fabric, hopefully I'll have something from you. Corda, multi-chain, these are permissioned blockchains, and a lot of them tend to throw out the disintermediation, at least the complete disintermediation of public blockchains. So they bring in membership plans, or they bring in curation, and in that way a form of control is again introduced. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes you can't do without control for regulatory reasons. But it also leads to the problem, you bring in the single point of failure again. Because if you have one point that has access to everything, then you have a problem, because that's exactly where you can be attacked. And that throws out most of the usefulness. If you can change a blockchain, yeah.
But you still get to keep the immutability, right?
Do you?
Which is what companies want. Well, if you distribute the ledgers to a consortium,
yeah,
you still have the same.
But if you can still change something with an admin function, who's going to look? If we have consensus that you can change something in a small group of stakeholders, right, it's still changed. And the thing is, once you start with that, mostly these things first happen under duress, when you have a problem. Look at Ethereum with the DAO. Before that was no problem. We're an immutable blockchain. Then you have something that shakes you to the core, really, really hard. And then you need to make a gut decision. You need to make a decision, are we going to bail out or not? And the choice was, well, the fun thing with forking is, you can do both. And Ethereum basically did it. One fork didn't, one fork did. But once you start doing it, it's very hard to stop. So it's, again, an attack surface, but it's also, can you really trust it from that point? If you can't really spot the change. Look, if you just make an amendment to a ledger, you say, for instance, this data is now out of date at block this, and from then we do this. Then you can see, then it's auditable. I'm fine with that, because I can see the change. But if you can actually reach back and change it, and then build the blockchain again, without being able to see the change, if you can do that, you have a big problem. Because that's worse than what we have now.
Right. Well, I was under the impression that with hybrids like Hyperledger Fabric,
yeah,
it will be impossible to immute the data, the change the blocks.
Could you? Do you? Yeah,
I'm really
please.
into hybrids.
If we have an expert
Yes,
here,
yes,
I'd like
it's-
to hear. And
It's a hot topic, right?
Yeah.
Indeed, Hyperledger is immutable.
Right.
You cannot change anymore. So everything which is on the blockchain of Hyperledger Fabric cannot be changed. There's of course a challenge for GDPR.
Yeah.
Right? So
It is.
if we put personal information on the blockchain, you cannot change it. You
Yeah,
cannot
delete it.
have the right to be forgotten. So that's why we have some special architectural solutions for that. But indeed, it cannot be changed. But here is Corda, for instance. Corda has an option to change, to roll back the transaction from the past. So I believe, but maybe I'm wrong, that Corda is not really 100% immutable. Yeah, but Fabric is.
Yeah.
okay. For multi-chain, I also don't really know.
No.
But this is the idea: is if you ditch disintermediation, you get this specter of possible change.
Maybe while I'm now on Fabric, not to save for later, but the central theme of disintermediation is not the core of Fabric.
No.
That's just to be sure.
No, exactly.
Fabric
that's
is
what I'm
just a
saying.
technical platform. You can do
Yeah.
anything with it.
Right.
And one consequence is potential disintermediation. Another consequence is that you can audit all the transactions from the past.
Yeah.
Another consequence, etc. So the core reason for existence of Fabric is not disintermediation. So that's what I'd like to correct.
Yeah, no, exactly. But that's what I call you take away because that's not your engineering goal. So,
It's a consequence.
yeah. The disintermediation can also be thrown out in the application. Like I said, if you get a complete system with only custodial wallets, let's say everybody goes on Coinbase, then the disintermediation is also gone because everybody is on a centralized system, even though the underlying asset is still technically decentralized. We have membership plans, asset-backed tokens, centralized consensus plans. Asset-backed tokens are an interesting beast because they're also basically centralized on the outside because you need somebody to attest to the existence of the assets behind the tokens, and that's a centralized process. So if I want to have a gold-backed token, it's very nice. I can have a decentralized token representing gold. DigiDAO is an example of this. Who's going to say that gold is there? Well, the company who's actually having the vault. I still need to trust them. So it's just moving the goalposts. Doesn't mean it's useless, because it can add things like you have the possibility to trade whenever you want in a much more frictionless way, but it's not decentralized. And probably could then also be done via a database if the willingness of the parties is there. That's a different thing. This is, I think, a very important one, and this is one which is a big problem for starting blockchains, is they can't make a fresh start. Everybody knows what could happen. So in 2009, 2010, 2011, you had a few crazy people who were doing a thing with Bitcoin, which was a worthless token. And you could, yeah, sure, they bought a few pizzas and t-shirts with it, but it wasn't really worth something. So the dynamics of that was, you've got a few people who were actually quite crazy and who were willing to work on this for free or just for fun, and put up servers at a loss because the energy, it wasn't covered by the tokens at all. They just did it because they were interested in this topic. So the network grew, and then a first exchange came, and suddenly it was $1, what the hell? And a few new people came in, saw, hey, maybe we can make a buck of this. And then the dynamics changed from 2012, 3 years after. A new project today has a huge problem because they attract a certain kind of people into the project which doesn't care about the project. Last year, sometimes you saw people going into new blockchain projects just to buy the tokens, and they didn't care, and they still don't care. If you talk to them about decentralization, just meh, why? As long as it works, and if we go to the moon, it's fine. And again, that's legitimate, because people are allowed to want money. That's not a problem, but it's a huge problem for a project that wants to build. So even if you're a legitimate project, you often have a lot of problems attracting people who are actually aligned with your goal of creating something which works like startup. And anybody who started a business knows that it takes a lot of time to get to profit. That's a normal thing. It's also a healthy thing, I think. So the immaculate conception, as it's been dubbed, is not possible anymore because everybody knows what kind of child could be born. The next one could be the Messiah again and make us rich. So yeah, that's not really what the Christian Messiah is. Still, this is a big problem. The incentives are different, completely different, and you see a lot of projects needing to think up ways just to combat this. Some actually incentivize it by things like bounty programs, and then you really have a problem because mostly bounty people are the ones who are most vocal, where are my coins, and that takes a lot of time too. So many projects also don't think from first principles, so decentralized ditched, and for instance, things like this is delegated proof of stake is a favorite of mine. Delegated proof of stake is a proof of stake where you vote for somebody who is going to be able to construct blocks. So it's representative decentralization, which means in some systems you have 101, some systems have 500 people who are block producers. So it's not decentralized at all anymore. You just give away your power in the hopes that something flows back to you. Something that works in representative democracies with all its trade-offs, but it's not, in consensus, it's a really big one, because if you shrink the pool of people who can collude, you make the chance of collusion actually bigger. So this is the same with governance. There are a lot of blockchains thinking about governance. From the best intentions is, okay, we need to find a way to make the updating of the software a bit, well, less chaotic than in a non-governed blockchain. So they do things with voting. Voting is eminently suited for Sybil attacks. So you can have double accounts voting, or you can buy votes. If you have a whale who's going to buy votes to implement a feature that benefits him directly, you have a huge problem. And that sort of thing doesn't mean it will happen, but it opens up again another attack that you don't want. So that's a decentralization ditch. Badly written code is, of course, a big one. A lot of projects just fail because the code is badly written and not peer reviewed, or not even having any code. This is a fun thing. I was in an interview today and we were talking about Petro, which is interesting, and we were doing a talk before we started, and somebody asked, does anybody know what platform the Petro is running on? And I thought it was NEM. Another guy said Ethereum. And it ended up that nobody really knew anymore. It used to be NEM, but apparently there is no code. So it's basically one coin now.
It's called Maduro. It's called Maduro.
Yes, for the coin of Maduro, yes, exactly. And they're doing even a worse thing now. You now only can buy a Venezuelan passport with Petro. This is really getting weird. But that's outside scope of this talk. So badly written code or no code at all. There are a lot of projects with no code at all. Naive assumptions are also an interesting one. This is, people won't hurt their economic value. This is one that's in Bitcoin. It's underpinning that you have, the miners will not hurt their own economic incentives. But they could. Bitcoin has one thing that it cannot defend itself, which is a rich madman. Somebody who just doesn't care. He could easily pump in a lot of money into mining and destroy the whole thing. And then do the thing that you say. Let's say Chinese government, which is a completely different incentive than monetary in this case, decides, let's just push these miners to mess up the whole blockchain, then they would. So it can't defend against that unless you fork or start a new blockchain and say, okay, we stop here. Probably that will happen. Investors will want the project to succeed is a hilarious one. Investors don't want the project to succeed. Most investors, at least from last year, want to make money. And if that means the project must succeed, that's fine. But if it means they can just pump the coin with whatever false advertising they can, they will. So that's a naive assumption. And entrepreneurs want control. Is from the other side, that all entrepreneurs necessarily would want to have control over the system they're working with. That's a naive assumption on why people won't go for Bitcoin for their companies. But there are other ways to make money without necessarily having control over the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, I might make a slight remark.
Yes, please.
As an investor in cryptocurrency.
I'm not saying all investors.
All right, I think many investors will really want projects to succeed.
Yeah, no, that's fine, but I think you cannot disagree that a lot don't care, just don't care either. So
there's many different investors.
Yeah, exactly. So then this is the naive assumption is all investors want it to succeed. So, but it's good that you
Maybe you want to separate speculators and investors.
Yeah. Okay.
Just saying.
Yeah. So, one thing from the blockchain tech, so this is not Bitcoin again, this is blockchain, is that due to this vagueness in the industry, the fact that it can go all over the place, it tends to be very full of contradictions and assumptions and different kind of definitions. Even the word decentralization, because we say decentralization, but if you look at the original definitions for computer science, it's actually distributed that we're talking about. So we're not talking about the decentralized system because it actually would have few nodes. We're talking about a distributed system. So this, even such a simple word, can already make discussions. If you're talking to a computer scientist and you say decentralized, he's talking from his point of view and you're talking from basically saying distributed. Then you have a problem because your assumptions are wrong. The same with if you don't define your goals, what do you actually want? Do you want a blockchain which is completely disintermediated, or are you actually engineering a system where that's not a goal? And then you're going to get called on, yeah, but you're not disintermediate. Yeah, but that's not what we're building. That kind of vagueness in the business is still a big problem. And I have no idea how to solve it, except that everybody, when getting into a discussion, tries to define, just like you, by the way, just did with me, tries to define what are you actually saying. I say investor, you consider yourself an investor, but actually say that the people I'm talking about, you consider speculators. Okay. That's a good thing to have clear from the start.
Isn't that we're not investors, we're token holders, like on a legal perspective?
As long as we define it before we start talking, at least we go past that stage. Because the actual thing that you want to discuss is the behavior of the group that you want to discuss. And if you already find out you have two words for that, because I'm being vague, one is a container thing with many different kinds of investors in it, one of them being speculators, I actually mean speculators, then you get this kind of problem. So I think it's important. It also makes it very easy for bad projects to just say, yeah, but we didn't mean that. We meant this, which doesn't fall under the problems that we have. So it's moving the goalposts. It makes it very easy for bad projects. So they tend to be like bar talk. It's wide-ranging, rambling. It's very entertaining to talk blockchain, but it tends to get exhausting if you don't get anywhere. It's, whereas, like I said at the start with the Bitcoin discussions, if you know what you're talking about, you can at least say, okay, you're wrong, you're right at the end, or at least we're going this way because of this. So definition is, I think, a very important one. I think this is, for me, an important one. Jetson core design principles are useless at best, fraudulent at worst. I think that's a pretty bold statement, but for me this holds. Again, I'm not saying that permissioned blockchains are useless. I think they can do good innovations and and optimizations, but for new things, real innovation, I think we need to try to work from the assumptions of immutability and disintermediation and see where that gets us. If it becomes difficult, and it will, then it's an interesting creative challenge to see how we can overcome it from the position of, okay, we want to keep this, and now we need to try and make it work. That would get us to something new. Fraudulent is, by the way, defined as people who know it won't work and still sell their product. That's fraudulent. Useless is, it just doesn't work. And that's fine. If you have a project where you're not selling a project that doesn't work, not a problem. This should start from a very clear insight into the problem they want to solve, not naive assumptions about the problem they find interesting. And we again come from voting, identity, security, trading, money, these things. And naive, I mean, is with no idea what work has already been done. A lot of projects seem to have little historical insight in the fact that voting is something that has at least 2,500 years of history already behind it. So you need to have a way to find out, for instance, why things didn't work or why voting systems were implemented in certain ways. Trading definitely has a long history. There are thousands of books about it, there are whole theories, systems about it. You need to, instead of saying, I think we need to trade faster, that's not really a good starting point. You need to find out why is it being done the way it is now, how can you do it better, those kinds of things. Security is definitely one where I think a lot of blockchains, at least from the security people that I see speaking about it, are very worried about it, and this is also a GDPR thing, for instance, that we throw information on blockchains which is very vulnerable, which you can't do. So why would you actually throw information on a blockchain in the first place? How do we deal with that? Identity is a fun one because this is one of the things that you will see in any blockchain. Yes?
Sorry, if I can interject.
Yeah.
Don't you think that hybrid blockchains like Hyperledger are kind of an intermediate phase because they actually have privacy, whereas Ethereum is like a public blockchain. You can read all these smart contracts, and you serve your scaling issues. Yeah. So I don't disagree with you that I think down the line, like I don't know, 5 or 10 years down the line, these permissionless blockchains will offer all the functionality that we so desire. But don't you think that the hybrid blockchains would kind of be a step in between between our centralized systems and the blockchain utopia?
I'll just point to the title of the thing, is why they're interesting to me. Doesn't mean, look, if I find the thing is, I think this industry is interesting because of the disruptiveness and the fact that I think we can dig down and try to crack this nut. That doesn't mean that the others are useless. Boring isn't useless. Boring is boring. So yes, and it's actually fun because yesterday, for instance, on the Bitcoin blockchain, we just got the liquid network of Blockstream. It's a sidechain, and it's not decentralized at all. It's a pegged sidechain to the Bitcoin blockchain, and a lot of people are going to hate it. But effectively, it's a hybrid system. Again, it's meeting some part of the market which has a problem doing some things on the Bitcoin blockchain and offering them a solution as a company. So they can now move their Bitcoin onto this sidechain, then transact between themselves. These are confidential transactions. Nobody can see what's happening there, which is what they need because they're transferring value, and they don't want to open that up. But I know that a lot of people are going to hate it, and from their position, probably with good reason, because they say, okay, yeah, but this is a step backward. Basically, you now have a decentralized system, but to actually make it work, you need a centralized system. I can imagine that being a laughing stock from quite a lot of people. Again, it will feed the Blockstream narrative fine. But yeah, I think look, we can't stop it anyway. I'm just trying to get the perspective across where I think the interesting things are, and what I'm a bit well, it's disappointed. That is disappointed with is when it gets hard. Instead of saying let's ditch this because it's too hard, I like the companies that say this is hard, let's bite down. And after 2 years, they come with a solution which is new and actually keeps the core tenets, and not the Bitcoin core tenets, but basically the fundamental tenets of what makes a blockchain, and then makes it work. And then you have something innovative and new, something that we don't have. If that actually doesn't meet any requests from customers, they have a different problem. Because then nobody's going to use it, but at least they've tried and we have new knowledge. And what I see with quite a lot of things, and you see it in more and more communities, the decentralization doesn't really matter. EOS, for instance, has as a core tenet that in dApps, decentralization doesn't matter really all that much. If you want vague, that's a very vague state. Doesn't really matter all that much. That's a great thing to get down.
You got like a billion.
Yeah, how many decentralizations do you want? It doesn't really matter. But that's the kind of, I think it's a pity. I think we can do better. So also money is an interesting thing, of course, because we had this whole discussion about Bitcoin, is it money or not? And does it actually matter if it's money or not? Or is it just kind of a wheelbarrow to move value, which is money, but something else altogether? This one is, the last one is from the perspective that you shouldn't mimic Bitcoin, from the whole immaculate conception thing. Just because Bitcoin succeeded the way it did, from a completely unknown to something that is now usable, doesn't mean your project needs to take the same route. And especially if you have a very clearly defined goal, you'll probably get a lot of problem because you will not reach it immediately. It's hard. The thing like this, identity, for instance, we have, I think, 3 or 4 projects that want to do identity on the blockchain, and it's a hard problem. It's not something that's been around for just 1 year or 2. This is a long problem. How do you actually identify somebody digitally, and how much information do you get across? That's not something you'll solve in just 1 year with, let's put it on the blockchain. So, and it has no financial incentive directly, so you need to put that on, or do you? I'd like to see a project that just said, no, our project is altruistic and won't make a profit. Let's see if it probably won't work, by the way, but that's another thing. But at least try a different avenue. There is no reason why you would particularly need to go that way. Probably you'll end up with something to make it secure, but maybe not. And those are basic questions that I think any project should ask. One extra one I didn't put in here is, do we need a token? Because every project wants a token, but sometimes it's not necessary. Hello, are you going to be here? Good. So, and these 2 sentences, blockchains in their simplicity are very hard, because something you implement now will probably come back to haunt you in a few years, because your customers or your users are going to have behavior you cannot predict. So you will have emergent behavior, and if especially your economic incentives are wrong, it will bite you in the bone hard. So that's also a good one. One other thing for all blockchain ideas, because this is, are they useful? Yes, they are useful. I've been, like I said, I started this as an amateur, but because you are in a new segment, you get to talk with a lot of people you never got to talk with. So you talk with banks, as you said, at the port of Rotterdam, you get supply chain people. And a lot of things really are a mess. It's horrible sometimes how much is just done by paper, for instance, which is sent by DHL because you can't digitize it, because that's even worse. So there is a lot of work to do. It's not as if there isn't a use for a new form of digitization that actually is safe. So that's a good one. we have a true opportunity, and I think blockchain, whatever it may be, not the Bitcoin blockchain in that sense, not that kind of structure, also probably not any of the blockchain forms we see now, because they're first generation for the blockchain thing. And it will probably only be a very small part of an overall solution, because blockchains can't do all that much. They are very good at putting transactions together and linking them and making attestations of this happened at that time. That's what they're very strong at. They're not that strong at anything else. So they won't be a catch-all solution. So it might be interesting for most projects to at least also find ways how they link to existing structures, for instance. Because even by changing a very small part of an infrastructure, you can change a lot. So for instance, a lot of parts of infrastructure, for instance, are meant to protect certain pieces of data. What if you could discard them? What does that do for your project? That can already be a huge saving, or it can completely change the way in which you input data. These are all things where very small changes can have huge knock-on effects, and I think that will be the place where we'll see most things happen. So let's make the engineering clear and hard by making the goals simple. That's basically what I'd like to see. Keep the goals very simple, very auditable, so we can't bullshit each other too much. There's always a bit of bullshitting, but at least we can check up on the bullshitting. So also engineers have a very clear path to work to, where you can iterate, where you can see this doesn't work, okay, we need to tweak this, or we need to scrap the complete thing and start over again, which is also fine at this point, I think. That's me. I hope at least it gave you some idea of where I stand, and maybe sharpened your thought on the subject too. Thank you.
We can still take 2 quick questions, so in case there are some.